I am super delighted to introduce Barry Schwartz, who's with us today to talk about how higher education can cultivate practical wisdom. Barry has spent 50 years thinking and writing about the interaction between economics, psychology, and morality. He is an emeritus professor of psychology at Swarthmore College and a visiting professor of the Haas School of Business at Berkeley. He has written many a book that address the interactional aspects of these relationships, including The Battle for Human Nature, The Cost of Living, The Paradox of Choice, Practical Wisdom, and most recently, Why We Work. He has also written for a wide range of outlets, including the New York Times, the New York Times Magazine, Chronicle of Higher Education, Slate, Scientific American, The New Republic, Harvard Business Review, and The Guardian. He has appeared on dozens of radio shows, including NPR's Morning Edition, Talk of the Nation. He's been interviewed on Anderson Cooper 360, the PBS NewsHour, Colbert Report, CBS Sunday Morning, and he has spoken 4 times at the TED Conference, and his TED Talks have been viewed by more than 20 million people. Yes, that is 20 million people. So welcome, Barry. We're delighted to have you here today.
I'm honored to be with you, and I must say, I'm impressed.
You are indeed impressive. So I'm hoping today we can do 3 things to explore, reflect, and consider. First, explore your work in practical wisdom, the scholarly origins, its basic tenets, and where it's taken you more recently. Second, hoping you can reflect on this crazy year, and then consider the implications of your work for higher education and what we might collectively be doing both differently and better. Seem reasonable?
I'm with the program, and we're going to do all this in what, 40 days? Did you say?
That's right. So this will be part 1. So your book, I realize, is published just about a decade ago. And I think it's having, at least at Duke, I'd say, quite a bit of a revival. And I think the kinds of questions it addresses are perhaps every day more prescient. So could you give us a little sense of where the ideas came from, how it evolved in your own thinking as a scholar?
Sure, I'm happy to. So I wrote the book with a good friend and colleague, Kenneth Sharp, who taught political science at Swarthmore, especially political theory. And years ago, we taught a course on sort of the downside of liberal individualism and the way in which that sort of view, which is almost like fish living in water in a society like the US, how, it permeates our thinking. And there's a lot that's really attractive about the way in which individualism empowers us to become the people we think we should be. But there's also a really dark side to it. It corrodes community. It makes any kind of concerted effort to achieve a common good difficult. In fact, it makes even talking about what a common good might be difficult. So we taught this course, and we kept on talking after we had taught this course, and we came eventually to this conclusion that what was missing in the American language, especially among intellectuals, was any kind of discourse about character and virtue. That we were extremely reluctant to say things like, this is a good person, or what does it mean to be a good person? Because that was so value laden, and in an individualistic society, the last thing you want to do and feel authorized to do is to impose your values about what's good on other people. So there was a kind of bankruptcy of language and a lack of nerve to talk about these issues. And in the absence of an alternative to liberal individualism, you could criticize it up and down and nothing, it wouldn't move the needle at all. And so he teaches Aristotle and Plato in his ancient political theory class. And we started talking about Aristotle, which led us to talk increasingly about phronesis, about wisdom, which led to a course with the most daunting syllabus you've ever seen, and eventually the book. So it grew out of our realization that simply criticizing the dominant mode of discourse was not enough. You needed to present and describe and sort of flesh out an alternative discourse that might be a good substitute.
So could you describe a little bit then the core arguments that you two are trying to make in the book? And then let's go from there.
So the core argument is that most of the institutions that we rely on in the Western rich democratic world are broken. They're not doing what we want them to do, what we need them to do, and what we expect them to do. And that leaves us dissatisfied with the way we're educated, with the way we're, whenever we need to seek justice, with the healthcare we receive. Nothing is working the way it should. And it's not only the consumers who are dissatisfied, the practitioners are too. Doctors think they can't practice medicine the way it should be practiced. Teachers think they can't teach the way they should be teaching. Lawyers think it's all about billable hours and not about justice. This is not why I went to law school, blah, blah, blah. So there's a kind, everything's broken. And when you encounter things that are broken, you have two tools that you rely on. Tool number one is make more rules. You know, if the education system's not working, impose rigid structures on teachers so that they will work better. Give them rules, give them scripts. So those are like the sticks. And tool number two, very free market based, is create the right incentives. Make it worth doctors' while to practice medicine the right way, and worth teachers' while, and so on. Dangle those carrots. And the argument that we make in the book is that neither rules nor incentives can do the job. There is no substitute for having people who do the right thing because it's the right thing, not because somebody is standing over you with a whip, and not because somebody is standing over you with a carrot. That those are very blunt instruments for the kind of nuanced situation by situation judgment that's required for you to be a good teacher of every student, a good doctor of every patient, a good lawyer for every client. And that framework of judgment and the desire to do the right thing to achieve excellence in your domain comes right out of the virtue ethics of Aristotle. So what we try to do is sort of explain what that is, how it's not, it's not some long bearded person high on a mountaintop telling us abstract things about how to live, but very concrete, very practical, very much situation specific. Aristotle realized that these virtues get deployed in ways that vary from one context to another, one person to another. And a virtuous person needs to be a wise person, but wise in the practical sense of figuring out, what does this third grader need that's different from what that third grader needs? And so we spell this out and then talk about how it applies in law, in education, in medicine, and so on. What we didn't do, and in the light of the current context, we really should not have missed it, is to talk about how it applies when it comes to law enforcement. You know, one view of what has broken in this country, as so obviously broken now, is that we don't know how to create wise police officers. And there's nothing in place to instill in law enforcement the kind of nuanced judgment that's actually required to figure out the right solution to the myriad problems that they face on an hourly basis when they're doing their patrols. So that was, so we really tried to make the book very practical, really talking about what's gone wrong in these various institutions we rely on, and how instilling this virtue, this pursuit of excellence, the pursuit of the right aims is the missing ingredient without which rules and incentives, no matter how cleverly devised, will never get us what we want.
Great. So there's a whole lot there, even before we get to the issue of policing and police training. So let's just pick away a little bit at some of the ideas here. So, great. This distinction between wisdom and rules is really a critical one. How do you connect this notion of instilling virtue in individuals with the institutions that individuals are a part of?
Mm.
How do you connect those two units of analysis, if you will?
It's a real challenge. I mean, both conceptually and even more so practically. One of our Bibles, as we wrote this book, is a book called After Virtue by philosopher Alistair McIntyre, and he talks about the virtuous practitioner on the one hand, and the institutions needed to support those practitioners on the other. And he says the virtuous practitioner pursues excellence that is appropriate to that practice. You know, what is great as a violinist depends on the standards that experts at violin have laid down. And to be a great violinist is not to be a famous violinist. It's not to be a rich violinist. It is to be somebody who is excellent at producing the sounds that violin playing is supposed to produce. You can't be an excellent violinist without an orchestra. Orchestras have to do various things in order to pay the bills, pay the rent, and so on and so forth. Institutions frequently compromise with the purity of purpose that the practitioners they're supporting pursue in order to enable those practitioners to pursue them. And it seems to me this is a perfect description of the modern university. You know, it costs a lot of money to run a university. It costs a lot of money for people like us to walk around with clean hands, pretending that there aren't unseemly things going on backstage that enable us to do the work that we do. So the challenge is to maintain institutions that have to be very this worldly so that they can maintain us and allow us to pursue some pure model of what ideal practice is. So it is really a challenge. And let me just say one other thing about this. Using your judgment, which is really what wisdom is all about, means, you know, one reason there are rules is to protect us from people having bad judgment. And sometimes that bad judgment may just be from a lack of appropriate education. Sometimes it may be from bad will. And so, you know, it's become a watchword these days that we have to be worried about implicit bias. Well, implicit bias, which in my reading as a psychologist is not something you can make go away. All you can do is try to counteract it. We can't unlearn it. It's sort of the way we are. Well, one tool for mitigating implicit bias is to have a very clear-cut set of rules that essentially make it impossible for my biased judgment to win the day in deciding who to hire. And so the price you pay for relying on the judgment of people like me and you is that, you know, imperfections in our judgment creep in, and without our intending it or even being aware of it, we sort of reproduce ourselves instead of doing what we really ought to be doing. So there's a good justification for having rules. They really do protect us from bad things, but there's a price, and we have tended to think that there's no price. It's all good.
So as you describe it in that example, I think it's a great space where rules and judgment are interacting in important ways. And you also described, right, sort of how institutions may have dirtier hands than virtuous individuals. how does that work in practice? Can we create virtuous rules? Can we create virtuous institutions? Or do they need to be separate in some ways, right? That one really enables the other.
I think I don't want to give the impression that I actually have an answer to this question. It's really a hard question. I think they have to be an interaction because it simply can't be acceptable that at the institutional level anything goes. You can't do anything to enable the two of us to behave as purists. So there have to be constraints. Who's going to impose those constraints? You know, the job of the vice president in charge of finance or development is to put as many dollars into the bank account as possible. That's what they're supposed to be doing. You can't rely on them to impose ethical limits on what they'll do. You know, they may pressure the dean of admissions to admit this kid whose parents are billionaires because they can see the building that will come as a result of admitting this kid. So they're not going to do it. So we have to be talking to them. We have to be looking out that the sort of relaxation of standards that we otherwise uphold is done within bounds and with an appreciation of the price you pay when you relax these standards. And they, in turn, have to educate us about the price, institutional price we pay in order to behave with complete freedom and pursue whatever problems we think are worth pursuing without regard for the practical challenges that pursuing those problems might pose. So I think there needs to be a conversation, and both sides need to think that the other part of the conversation means well and is trying to enable the institution to function as it should. But there's almost certainly going to be conflict. I can remember years ago at Swarthmore, the head of development, there was a new budget proposed and development wanted to add 4 people to its staff. And Swarthmore is a small place. That's a lot of people at an institution like Swarthmore. And he pointed out that every hire brings in $8 for every dollar that the hire costs, you know, in terms of, you know, gifts. So one of my colleagues, a philosopher, said, well, seems to me we should fire all the faculty and just hire people in development. You know, he didn't mean it, but what he was trying to do was he introduced this reductio to force us to think about how, other than cost-benefit calculation, can we come to an agreement about what's an appropriate balance of what the institution needs and what the institution is for. And I think it's an ongoing conversation that has to be, and the bigger the place is, the harder it is for those conversations to occur, because there are so many levels of bureaucracy that sort of separate the real players from one another.
Great. I want to step back a little and talk a little bit about the evolution of these ideas and in the context of a relationship that you had with a colleague, and in terms of starting this work through classes, and get you to reflect a little bit about the decade that has passed. So you started, you know, with this observation of institutions are broken, and that there doesn't seem to be much conversation about character or virtue or judgment in that conversation. So we talk about additive rules or additive incentives to fix institutions. I would think that a decade ago, that was a harder conversation to have than it is now. It seems that we are having increasing conversations over time about character and virtue rather than less. Is that your sense, or was the language of character and virtue well received at the time with students, with colleagues, in classroom conversations?
It was, I mean, can Ken Sharp was an extremely successful and popular teacher. I was a pretty successful and popular teacher. The students were willing to give us a lot of space because of the reps that we brought into the classroom. But here we were, two middle-aged white guys telling them how they should live their lives. That was not easy. And there was a great deal of resistance. And it was really resistance to the notion that there were moral standards that were in some sense general that and should be normative, that we would expect any respectable person to adhere to. And what we were trying to do in this class is to figure out what those normative standards should be. So it was not an easy conversation then. And if my assessment is that it's actually, even though people may use those words more now than they did 10 or 15 years ago, it's actually harder to have the conversation now than it was then. And I think this is partly a consequence of our acknowledgement that, middle-aged white guys like me do not have the only possible purchase on what's true and what's valuable. And we have to make sure that there are other voices in the conversation. That said, when these other voices are invited in and they say things that are different from what we're saying, well, then what? Do you simply keep adding new features to your model of what's a virtuous person, what character is? Or do you find some way to modify the old white guy's views with the inputs from these previously invisible other sectors of the community? These are very, very hard conversations to have, I think. There's an expression that I sometimes hear that it's like chalk on a blackboard, nails on a blackboard to me. When people say they say, well, this is my truth. And I recoil because I think that's just the wrong way to put it. This is what my perspective adds to the truth, is the way I'm more comfortable, because that at least suggests that there is a conversation to be had about how we all will change our understanding of what's true in this piece of the world. When you say this is my truth, that's the conversation stops. What can you possibly say in response to an assertion? This is my truth. This is the way the world is as I see it, full stop. And I think there's been a lot, honoring voices that have been silenced and giving them prominence, which is a good thing, has led to a kind of sort of invisible shield around what people say when they've finally given a platform that makes it very hard to have a conversation that doesn't feel like it's a threat or a challenge. So I don't think the words may be bandied about more, but I don't think that the conversation's making a hell of a lot of progress, because everyone is very, very sensitive about encroaching on the visions of other people.
So would it be fair to say that while we use the words more often, what they mean is contested? Is that partly what you're trying to say? Or is it that there's greater concern about the moralizing, the judgment pieces of it?
I think it's more the latter.
Okay.
I think we don't analyze what these words mean terribly carefully. So, and they're familiar enough. And this, again, McIntyre makes this point in the book After Virtue. Our conversation is full of virtue language, justice, freedom, rights, and all that stuff. None of that went away. It's just that those words don't mean what they once meant, because the meanings of those words come in part from the social practices of the community that uses those words. And as those social practices get more and more fragmented, we can use the same words, but we're never meaning the same thing as one another. And so there's a kind of, our lack of common understanding is hidden by the fact that we seem to have a common vocabulary. So I think that's really what the problem is. And it also masks the importance of finding a way to get a common vocabulary, because it seems like we understand one another since we're using the same words. This, incidentally, has also been one of the things that's concerned me about efforts on university campuses to make sure people speak respectfully to one another, essentially policing public language. There's something really important about that too. But if all you do is change how people talk without touching how they think, then the real problem just goes underground. At least when people feel free to say these outrageous things, you know what they think, and you can work on trying to change how they think. When they've learned how to, what's polite discourse, then they're essentially, they've built a shell around their beliefs, and nothing that happens to them while at the university breaks that shell. So, and I sort of think that's where we are in, most academic institutions are pretty progressive, liberal. It seems as though everybody in them pretty much agrees about all the things that are most important, and that just isn't true.
Wow, that's great. Super great. A real challenge if we're using the same words meaning fundamentally different things, right? So we have this perception of convergence that we just don't have in practice.
That's my concern.
Yeah. Let's pivot a little to talk about happiness. So since you wrote the book, right, the science of happiness is everywhere, that the concern for happiness, right, whether you're in an airport or a classroom, seems to be omnipresent. So you have a great section in the book that talks about the relationship between practical wisdom and happiness. Can you flesh that out for us?
Sure. So, well, first of all, I'm sort of involved on the fringes with this field that has emerged called positive psychology, which is understood as the psychology of happiness, although the people who started it, Martin Seligman in particular, had in mind a more Aristotelian notion of happiness, not the yellow smiley face notion. So it isn't about how can you walk around with a smile on your face, checking 6 on a 7-point, how are you feeling at the moment scale. So he cares about more substantive notions of happiness. The argument in the book is that the two most important determinants of our well-being, which is somehow less smiley-faced term than happiness, are close relations with other people and work that matters. If you do work that you think makes a difference and you have rich relations with a community of other people, pretty much everything else is gravy. And what we argue in the book is that you can't nurture and sustain close relations with other people unless you're wise, because people need different things at different times. And if you can't listen, empathize, and figure out what your close friend or your romantic partner or your kid needs, you're not going to be able to sustain the kind of rich relationship that you hope to. So it's a necessary ingredient to maintaining close relationships. And similarly, almost all the work that people do requires interacting with other people and having successful interactions with other people, colleagues at work, customers, superiors, demands the kind of judgment that wisdom enables us to display. So you will not be as successful in your work if you're not wise. You can't be as good a doctor if you're not a wise doctor, and you can't be as good a teacher if you're not a wise teacher, and so on. And you can't be as good a friend or as good a spouse or as good a parent. So wisdom is the secret to happiness, because wisdom is the secret to maintaining close relations to people you care about and being effective and successful at the work you choose to do. That's the argument.
So taking the term happiness, right, it does appear that the same kind of erosion of what it means has happened in that space as well, right? So you started by saying we're not talking about 7 out of 10 on the scale, or the extra smiley face. We're talking about something much more connected to virtue. is your sense that we are all talking about happiness now in different ways? Or do you think there is a purity to that conversation that lacks in a conversation about virtue?
Well, I'm afraid that I think we're almost all talking about it in the same way, and it's the wrong way of talking about it. Here's the thing. It's hard, effortful, time-consuming, full of mistakes to be wise. You're not born wise. You're going to make one mistake after another as you try to be a good teacher or a good parent or a good doctor. And slowly, if you're open to being educated by your failures, you get closer and closer to getting it right more and more of the time. And I don't think that this is a culture that is particularly comfortable with achievements that take enormous amounts of time and effort. And so if you say, no, 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 the happiness you have in mind, that's not the right conception. The one I have in mind, maybe you'll get there if you really do your best for 20 years in the classroom. It's like, okay, I'm going to turn the page and see and go for a slightly less challenging conception of happiness. So I think mostly people do think of happiness as smiley face, at least in practice, even though I teach a class at the business school called Work, Wisdom, and Happiness. And the aim of the class is to suggest that good work is essential to happiness. Wisdom is essential to good work. Therefore, wisdom is essential to happiness. And I'm teaching this to people who are mostly going to be managing other people. They're not going to be low in the organization. They're going to be high. And so I tell them, listen, I don't care much about whether you're happy in the rest of your life. What I care about is that you create conditions so that the people who work for you can be happy. That's what matters. I want this change to be wholesale, not retail. And it's hard. And it's not, I don't think, what they bargained for, although they do seem to be receptive to sort of thinking about how they can aspire to that when they leave the MBA and end up in management positions at, significant companies. How do you create a workplace where people want to be? If you start your job with asking yourself that question, that's an enormous progress over where things used to be, because it used to be that the answer to that was obvious. You just pay them well, and you've solved the problem. Well, no, you haven't. So I'm not, it's hard to get people to slow down and appreciate that hard things take time and effort to achieve. And most of the things that it is worth trying to achieve are hard.
Great.
I'm an old man, though. I don't think you should take what I have to say that seriously.
I want to return a little bit later to this notion of hard work on this road to wisdom and happiness. But first, let's jump into this past year. And I think you alluded to it a little bit, talking about police reform, but certainly a crazy year by any standard with the pandemic, but also sort of issues around racial justice. How has this year, if at all, changed, reinforced, edited your thinking, your original thinking in this book, Practical Wisdom?
Well, the pandemic piece, I don't think has had much changed the way we thought about wisdom. It has certainly posed problems, and I think made salient to people just how important their connections to other people are, to the life they want to live and the life they think they should live, in a way that they might have just taken it for granted when life was normal. And whether that will leave effects as we slowly crawl out of the pandemic is anybody's guess. You know, it's lasted long enough that one can imagine maybe the changes that people will show coming out of it will actually be lasting changes, and they'll be much more mindful of things that they took for granted before. We'll see. Um, so the pandemic hasn't changed much how I thought about wisdom, but the racial justice stuff really has. It made me much more aware than I was. I was aware sort of at an abstract level. I said it almost jokingly before that I'm an old white guy. And, you know, so I knew that my perspective was limited, but I also thought with hubris that without a whole lot of effort, I could put myself in the position of people who have been systematically excluded from the conversation. You know, I just had to open myself up a little tiny bit and I'd be there. You know, I'm a good person. I don't have a racist bone in my body, blah, blah, blah. We all say this to ourselves. And what this year taught me is how inadequate that was as a way of thinking about the problem. The problem is so deep and so pervasive that it's just extraordinary arrogance to imagine that somebody who has lived a whole life in the position I've lived my life can adopt the perspective of you know, one or another oppressed minority group. And so I have become a lot more humble when I utter my pronouncements about how society should be than I was prior to this year. And, you know, the fault is me. It's not, I shouldn't have needed the dramatic events that have occurred in this year to educate me. Other people got educated along these lines sooner than I did. And I'm not sure there's a substitute for making sure that the people whose voices need to be heard are part of the conversation and part of the institution. We can't represent for them. They have to represent for themselves and feel fully welcomed into the community in order for our thinking and our practices to be more inclusive than they have been. And I think McKenna and I were pretty much blind to just how big a problem this was when we were teaching the class and, you know, and writing the book. Taught the class for, I don't know, 6-7 years. Maybe we had three African-American students in all that time. Didn't occur to us that we were missing a significant part of the story. And I don't think we'd be quite so cavalier if we were doing it now. And that's a good thing.
Have you thought at all about what those voices would add or augment to the story, or do you think it needs an entirely new and different story to be written?
I don't know. At the very least, psychologists have distinguished from various different theoretical perspectives between fear and anxiety. Fear, which can be extremely debilitating, is fear of something. It has an object. And when that object is present, you're afraid. But when it's absent, you can relax. You can go about your life. Anxiety is essentially fear of everything. There is no object that provokes the fear. It's everything that provokes the fear. It's unbelievably debilitating to live in an environment where there are no danger signals and therefore no safety signals. And I think at least some of the experiences of people who have grown up in this culture are much more captured by this notion of anxiety than fear. That is to say, they live in an environment where danger is everywhere, where nothing is predictable. And it's very hard to cultivate your best self in an environment where where your main objective is to protect yourself and your loved ones from dangers of an unknown sort that can arise at any moment. And so I think that's why most of us in places like Duke and Berkeley and Swarthmore don't know what it's like to grow up in an environment where danger is everywhere. And I think that needs to be represented in the conversation because it is so different from being afraid of particular things and having enough control that you can make sure that those things are just never part of your life.
Great. What about higher education? What does your work in practical wisdom, even acknowledging, right, all the things and limitations you just described, how should we be thinking about higher education differently if we were going to take the cultivation of practical wisdom seriously?
Well, that's a terrific question. It's something I thought a lot about. I wrote an article that appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education several years ago on what I called intellectual virtues. And the argument I was trying to make is that there's just there would be too much opposition to the idea that college is here to create good people. It's not your job to create people of good character. It's the parents' job and the church's job. Know your limitations. On the other hand, creating people who have, quote, intellectual virtues is a different story. Maybe that is what the university ought to be about, because that's what universities do. They help nurture people who can make significant intellectual contributions to how society understands itself and operates. And so there are a list of virtues that I think are essential to this general category of intellectual virtue, or a list of traits that I think universities should be nurturing. One of them, which is especially salient in this time we've been living in the last 4 years, it seems either naive or obvious, and that is we have to teach students to love the truth. We have to teach them that their most important possession as part of an academic institution is truth. And it's hard to get, and there are lots of errors, pitfalls along the way, but you have to love it and be unwilling to compromise in pursuing it. And that's what you're here for. That's what the university is here for. It is here to find the truth. Understanding that there are limits of perspective, there are biases, there are all of these obstacles to getting it, but the objective is to get to the truth. And that's an essential ingredient. And I think I've never sat in on a class that made much of this. As I was telling you before we started, the guy who was the chair of the engineering program at Swarthmore told me that when the engineers came, freshman engineers in their first class, he said, listen, here's the thing you have to understand. If we screw up, people die. And it focuses the mind in a way that somebody who teaches classics really can't. If you screw up your interpretation of Plato, nobody dies. But if you screw up your calculations about how much stress a bridge can take, people will die. And that creates a kind of seriousness, burning desire to get things right that you don't see. You don't even see it in graduate students. Graduate students want to get things published. They don't want to get things right. Assistant professors want to get things published and they want to get grants. If it happens that what they are arguing is right, well, that's just like the icing on the cake. That has very little to do with your career trajectory. So that really needs to be, I think, a kind of emphasized attribute of everything that we teach in the university and the sacrifices that we make in order to try to achieve at least a partial understanding of what's true. Now, what does it take to seek the truth? You need to be a good listener, because forget about the obvious implicit biases that we pay attention to, racial bias, gender bias, that are so harmful in and of themselves. We are loaded with bias that isn't quite so malevolent. You know, we tend to fall in love with our hypotheses. And the result is that evidence that's consistent with what we believe, we notice, we take in, we trumpet. Evidence that's inconsistent with what we believe somehow is invisible to us. And this is a pervasive and pretty pernicious bias. How do you overcome it? Well, you overcome it by having people working together who don't all share exactly the same bias. You know, I have blinders on and you have blinders on, but if we don't have the same blinders on, you'll correct my mistakes and I'll correct yours. So there needs to be an openness, a willingness to listen to people who don't agree with you as an acknowledgement of your own imperfect grasp of the truth. And there needs to be humility for the same reason. Yeah, this is what I believe is true, but I could be wrong. There needs to be perseverance. As I said to you a few minutes ago, finding out about really important things is hard. It takes a lot of time and effort to get to the bottom of things that it's actually worth getting to the bottom of. So you have to be willing to put in the time. You know, you have to be willing to do the reading and not read the 15-minute summary or watch the TED Talk. Read the damn book, don't watch the TED Talk. We have to understand that it takes a kind of perseverance and patience to get, as I say, to get to a real understanding of things that matter. These are all intellectual virtues that together is what I think ought to be our objective in university education. The problem is Swarthmore is mostly small classes. These virtues can be exemplified in the way teachers interact with students. It's not quite the philosopher and the student sitting on opposite sides of a log, but it's, you know, it's kind of an approximation to that, at least in the last 2 years at Swarthmore, when classes are quite small. That isn't the way things go at places like Duke and Berkeley. You know, classes go from enormous to large. So, you know, and I don't think you can just lecture about these things. I think you really need to embody them and exemplify them. And it's really not easy to do that when education, even high quality education, is sort of mass produced. So saying that it's important is one thing. Giving you a sort of blueprint for actually exemplifying it in the day-to-day practices of you know, faculty as they interact with students and students as they interact with one another, that's another thing. So, but that I think is a reasonable mission for academic institutions without encroaching on the prerogatives of parents, churches, and what have you. We are not trying to teach you how to be a good citizen, a good person, a virtuous person. We're just trying to teach you how to be a virtuous student.
So let's take the example of engineering a little bit further. Before we were talking in here at the Pratt School of Engineering, they're doing a lot of work thinking about the integration of character into their curriculum, talking a lot about practical wisdom. As you describe it, and your colleague in engineering at Swarthmore, who starts with students and says, right, it's life or death. You need to be right. And I think to myself, right, sort of, you know, many, many years after being an undergraduate, and I think, wow, if I need to be right, I want some rules. Because then I can retreat to the safety of the rule,
Yep.
as opposed to exercising judgment.
Mm-hmm.
How do we encourage getting it right? Because it's life or death, and certainly as an ethicist, it's not life or death. But with this notion of wisdom and judgment, how do we reconcile the two, knowing that there's quite a bit of fear and or anxiety around getting it right?
So it's a great question. The way I think about it is that rules are kind of like a roadmap that gets you to the right city, but none of the streets are marked. I could never find the Duke campus without getting to the right city. So I need the roadmap, but the roadmap is not sufficient because it doesn't get me to the campus. Rules are the guardrails that get us to the right city. And in some domains, if you're doing cardiovascular surgery or designing a bridge, it may well be that rules get you pretty much all the way there. Because they're the kinds of uncertainties and multiple interests and perspectives that come into play maybe don't come into play when you're, unclogging an artery or building a bridge. But in a lot of domains, it doesn't get you all the way there. In a lot of medicine, for example, pre-pandemic, this will seem remarkably out of date. But pre-pandemic in the developed world, we had basically solved the problem of acute disease. And for the most part, the question was, how do we manage chronic disease? Hypertension, bad back, obesity, substance use. Well, all of these chronic problems, to manage them, you can't cure them, to manage them requires the cooperation of the patient. I can hand you a sheet of instructions about how to eat healthier and live healthy, lose 40 pounds, stop eating fat and salt, blah, 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 blah. And you'll walk out with this sheet and throw it in the first receptacle you can come to. And the reason is that you already know all of these rules. The problem isn't that you don't know what to do. The problem is, how do you get yourself to do it? So a good doctor managing chronic diseases that require cooperation from the patient is somebody who can develop a relationship with the patient and inspire the patient to believe that the doctor and the patient are on the same team and they're trying to achieve the same objective. No formal training in medicine gets you there, which I think is saying something about what's lacking in the formal training in medicine. How do you generate and maintain relations with patients so that you can inspire them to do their part in helping to control what would otherwise be very serious illnesses? That takes judgment. What will move you and what will move me is likely two different kinds of arguments, two different conversations. And the doctor needs to know each of us well enough to find the right words for each of us. 10-minute office visits do not encourage this kind of intimate knowledge of patients that might be required. So the roadmap gets you to knowing what should be on that sheet of instructions, but it doesn't tell you how to present that information in a way that will actually enable the patient to internalize it and be inspired by it rather than just turned off by it. And that's where wisdom and judgment are called for. Yeah, it's nervous making because you can't, if things go wrong, you can't blame the rules. There's a certain comfort in saying, I did everything right, I followed the rules. If something screwed up, blame the rules.
Great. Let me jump into a question. So one of the reasons some people have been reluctant to call others good or bad is not just individualism, but also the history of condemning certain marginalized groups and ways of living in virtue terms. And you talked a little bit about this.
Yep.
Especially for a queer person like me, virtue has been a weapon against us. How do you deal with this weaponizing virtue language, a history that I don't often see acknowledged in virtue in character research?
I wish I knew how to answer that question. That is indeed a huge problem. And it is, I think, hard to separate that language from the social context in which it was used, and used not just as a guide, but as a bludgeon. And there's no question that, even in Aristotle, the sort of father of virtue ethics, most of the people who lived in ancient Greece didn't count as people. So, he was writing about how privileged people should live their lives with hardly a thought about the excluded majority. So I do think we need to be extremely careful in using this language, but I also think we can't actually succeed as a society without it. And it's a lot easier to be virtuous in ancient Greece, which was pretty homogeneous, than it is to be virtuous in modern America, which is extraordinarily heterogeneous. And we learn every day that it's even more heterogeneous than we thought it was yesterday. So it's good to be very nervous about this talk and demand of people who use it that they answer your question. How does this language include me? Because it didn't include me when people first started talking in this way. And if they can't give you a satisfactory answer, then you try to help them come to a satisfactory answer. And if you can't, I think you just have to reject this framework. So if a virtue is being a good listener, when you raise this objection, people who use virtue language will take it seriously and try to find a way to accommodate your concern that you regard as satisfactory. But I certainly understand why it makes people who were excluded extremely nervous to hear people like me, especially, talking in this language.
Let's try to squeeze in one more. Thank you, Barry, for a fascinating presentation and discussion. It's clear that education for skills and knowledge is not enough to equip students, trainee professionals to address the dilemma decisions practice, and we as educators should aim to develop their practical wisdom. But how do we determine what constitutes practical wisdom in professional life? And how? Is there a role for professional associations as a route to collaborative collective phronesis?
There could be. I think what you need here, we're back into this question about the relation between individual practitioners and institutions. What do professional associations do? The American Psychological Association is the main national organization for psychologists. It is almost entirely devoted to clinical psychologists as opposed to academics. I mean, they're the center of gravity. 95% of psychologists are clinicians. And it's almost like a labor union, making sure that, fighting so that they get rights to write prescriptions, making sure that they get adequately compensated by insurance companies. So there's nothing about the center of gravity of that organization, at least as I see it, that's going to contribute to the conversation about phronesis in the discipline of psychology. That doesn't mean that there isn't a role for such organizations. It means that people have to appreciate that they ought to be playing this role and develop a language that guides practice rather than merely representing the demands or the needs of the membership. So I'm hoping that there could be standards in professions. And let me just say one other thing. I know that we have to end, but there's a lot of concern about the elitism here. So if lawyers set the standards for what constitutes excellence in the practice of law, and doctors set the standards for what constitutes excellence in the practice of medicine, then why don't they just become a kind of club of mutually reinforcing people who pat each other on the back no matter how inadequate their services are? I say that's bad medicine, and they say, what the hell do you know? You don't know anything about medicine. And of course, they're not wrong to say that. So on the one hand, you want practitioners to be setting their standards, but there needs to be some root in from the outside in case they get so parochial and so self-protective in the standards that they set that the whole practice has gone off the rail. So you can have everybody adhering to a certain set of ideals in the practice of medicine, and they could be the wrong ideals. And unless there's input from outside, no one inside will ever know. So there's, again, a tension, a conversation that needs to be had between the experts who really know a lot about what the standards ought to be and the non-experts who may see where the standards are falling short in a way that the experts can't. So that's, it's the thing about wisdom is it leaves you with one unsatisfying answer after another, because the right answer to every question invariably is it depends. people don't want answers like it depends.
That's great. So this has been one of the fastest hours I can recall. So thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks all of you who joined us for the lunch hour. Please join us next Tuesday. We'll have Bill Damon on purpose and character. Thanks so much, Barry. This was great. And it did indeed whiz by.
Thank you so much. You asked wonderful, wonderful questions, Suzanne. It felt like it was by for me too.
All righty. Have a great afternoon.
See you. Thanks for coming, people.